2 points, and they're quite important points.
Stop right there. Before we even get to the main point, I want to address something. Lennox refers to his own points as important. Is that arrogant? Not in his case. Arrogance is about unearned confidence, self-praise, or smugness. And that's clearly not the case here. Lennox has spent decades in serious scholarship and public debate. His confidence is earned. In fact, if you don't believe your point is important, why bother making it? Anyone engaging in thoughtful discussion should believe what they're saying matters.
And that is, we need to distinguish between evolution and the origin of life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Richard...
Got to distinguish between evolution and the origin of life. So, guys, origin of life, that's how you get your first living cell. How did you get to that thing? And then that thing turning into other things over time and based on replication and so on, that's a different thing. So
there is a massive distinction between evolution and the origin of life, though the two are obviously connected. Evolution refers to how life changes over time, how organisms diversify, sometimes becoming more complex, other times simpler, depending on environmental pressures, natural selection, mutation, and genetic drift. It explains how species adapt, survive, or go extinct. The theory of evolution begins after life already exists. Once there's a self-replicating system with genetic material like DNA or RNA. But the origin of life, often called abiogenesis, is the question of how life first began from non-living matter. It asks, how did chemistry become biology? Where did the first cell, the first genetic code, or the first replicating molecule come from? This distinction matters for several reasons. 1. Different scientific domains. Evolution is a well-established biological theory supported by observable evidence, fossil records, and genetics. Abiogenesis, on the other hand, is still a hypothesis in chemistry and biophysics. 2. Different challenges. Evolution works on existing life. It selects from what already replicates. But the origin of life involves explaining how replication began, how order came from chaos, and how the first cell overcame extreme improbabilities. Evolution is a process. Abiogenesis is a threshold, the leap from non-life to life. 3. Many critics of evolution, particularly from religious or philosophical perspectives, conflate the two, treating the mystery of life's origin as if it discredits the entire theory of evolution. But even if evolution were 100% proven, that still wouldn't explain where life came from. Conversely, even if the origin of life remains unexplained, it doesn't undermine the evidence for evolution. They're related but logically distinct. 4. Why it matters philosophically. If the origin of life is extraordinarily improbable, it raises different questions. Not about adaptation or natural selection, but about whether purely natural processes are sufficient to explain the very beginning. That's why some people appeal to intelligent design or theism, not to challenge evolution per se, but to address the mystery and impossibility of the beginning. Life had to begin before it could evolve. But confusing origin of life and evolution is like confusing the construction of a car with how it drives and changes.
Dawkins, as you know, who's a brilliant writer, I must say. I remember reading his book, The Blind Watchmaker.
Yes.
And what arrested me in reading it, and I can almost quote it verbatim, so that's a compliment to Richard.
The fact that you can quote something verbatim does not make it a compliment. Sometimes nonsense stands out so much that it is quite memorable.
That evolution, the blind automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and the development of all of life.
He said that.
Yes, it's in the book.
Yeah.
And it took a
that's terrible.
very long time for him to realize that the first part of that statement is false.
Yes.
For a very simple reason. Because evolution, again, whatever it does or doesn't do, depends on the existence of life to do anything. So it cannot be the explanation for life.
I believe the quote Lennox is referring to from Richard Dawkins is this one. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. If this is the correct quote, then Lennox is justified in pointing out that Dawkins appears to claim that natural selection is responsible not only for the form of life, but for its existence. This is a major error. Natural selection cannot account for the origin of life because it requires life to already exist. It operates only once there is a system capable of replication, variation, and heredity, none of which exist in non-living matter. Conflating the origin of life with the processes that shape it after is to confuse the creation of a book with the editing of the book. Natural selection may explain how life is refined and adapted over time, but it cannot account for how the first living systems, the biological language or book itself, came into being. What makes this mistake particularly glaring is the structure of the sentence. Dawkins doesn't say natural selection explains the form of life alone. He says it explains the existence and apparently purposeful form. Grammatically and logically, he presents existence as a distinct item natural selection accounts for, not merely a poetic flourish. That crosses a conceptual boundary that evolution cannot cross. Lennox is not strawmanning Dawkins. He is exposing a genuine problem in how Dawkins framed the relationship between evolution and life's origin, whether by carelessness or rhetorical overreach. While the prose in The Blind Watchmaker may sound polished, it conceals a fundamental category error. Evolution, as a theory, begins after life begins. Abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-living matter, is an entirely different question, and one that evolution does not attempt to answer. And yet, in The God Delusion, 2006, Dawkins seems to recognize and correct the error. The origin of life may have been a highly improbable occurrence. Darwinian evolution proceeds merrily once life has originated. But how does life get started? The origin of life was the chemical event, or series of events, whereby the vital conditions for natural selection first came about. The major ingredient was heredity, either DNA or, more probably, something that copies like DNA but less accurately, perhaps the related molecule RNA. Once the vital ingredient, some kind of genetic molecule, is in place, true Darwinian natural selection can follow, and complex life emerges as the eventual consequence. But the spontaneous arising by chance of the first hereditary molecule strikes many as improbable. Maybe it is. Very, very improbable. And I shall dwell on this. Here, Dawkins explicitly acknowledges that evolution only begins after a genetic replicator exists, a point absent, or at least obscured, in The Blind Watchmaker. Perhaps, as Lennox suggests, Dawkins refined his position over time. Or perhaps the earlier wording was simply imprecise. Either way, The Blind Watchmaker can certainly be read as implying that natural selection explains both the origin and development of life. If that interpretation is correct, then at worst, the claim is wrong, and at best, the language is ambiguous and misleading. In that sense, Lennox's critique stands. He is not misrepresenting Dawkins. He is holding him to the standard of clarity and precision that Dawkins himself claims to uphold.
Now, of course, people these days get round that by talking about chemical evolution and so on. That's nothing to do with mutation and natural selection, and we could go into that. But
it's like when you talk about the evolution of the universe or something like that. You're talking about a different kind of evolution than Darwinian evolution.
Chemical evolution, in the context of the origin of life, refers to the gradual process by which simple chemical compounds on the early Earth allegedly transformed into more complex molecules that eventually gave rise to life. This concept suggests that before biological evolution could begin, there was a stage of non-living molecular development, involving the formation of amino acids, nucleotides, and other organic building blocks through natural processes. These molecules then underwent further reactions, potentially forming self-replicating systems like RNA, and membrane-bound structures resembling primitive cells. Chemical evolution is said to be the foundation of abiogenesis. Neither chemical evolution nor any other theory currently explains the origin of life. The truth is, we simply do not know how life began. While chemical evolution may sound sophisticated, there is no conclusive evidence that it accounts for the emergence of life on Earth. Boddy Hodge and Roger Patterson write in World Religions and Cults, Volume 3, Chemical evolution or abiogenesis is how matter supposedly gave rise to life from non-living elements. The problem is that this has never been observed. Furthermore, one of the few laws in biology is the law of biogenesis that says life only comes from life. So to blindly believe in abiogenesis is not scientific, as it violates this verified law of science. Despite the evidence against it, atheists must believe it happened at least once in the past to be consistent in their materialistic worldview. While you may differ with their interpretation of the law of biogenesis or raise objections to some of their other claims, I defy anyone to provide a single verified example of life arising from non-life through purely natural processes. Everything in our experience, from biology to laboratory observation, confirms that life always comes from life. No exceptions have ever been found. The only so-called exception is an event said to have occurred 3.8 billion years ago, which no one was there to witness, and which remains completely unexplained. If life truly began at that point, the far more reasonable conclusion is not that life somehow emerged from non-living chemicals, an event that appears statistically and chemically implausible, but that life came from a source of life, namely, God. In fact, even the hypothesis that life came from aliens is more plausible than the idea that a functioning cell emerged on its own, given the immense molecular complexity involved. But of course, that just pushes the question back one step. Where did the aliens come from? If the first life was as simple as many claim, and if chemical evolution really has the power to create life, then scientists should be able to reproduce it in laboratory conditions. If life supposedly arose by chance in a hostile, uncontrolled environment, it stands to reason that intelligent scientists, using the finest equipment, purest chemicals, and most advanced techniques, should be able to produce a simple cell. But they can't. This ongoing failure reveals two things. First, that there is no such thing as a truly simple cell, and second, that the theory of chemical evolution has not demonstrated the feasibility of a naturalistic pathway to the origin of life. Far from confirming a purely material explanation, the evidence continues to expose just how improbable and unexplained life's beginning really is. When presented with these facts, many atheists instinctively fall back on the tired accusation, "That's just the God of the gaps fallacy." It's a mindless reflex, not a reasoned response. They repeat this line with the same uncritical zeal as the Free Palestine crowd chants its slogans. Both are clinging to simplistic narratives that collapse under scrutiny. And yes, I'll be addressing both in future videos, so make sure to subscribe. But let's dismantle this God of the gaps claim. It doesn't apply here. This isn't about inserting God into a gap in our knowledge. It's about confronting a direct contradiction in the naturalistic worldview. The evidence doesn't merely leave a gap. It reveals a wall. Abiogenesis appears statistically impossible. That's not about ignorance. That's a problem. There are holes in the narrative. And when your current explanation collapses under the weight of its own improbability, the rational move is to consider alternative explanations. Right now, the most reasonable alternative is design. We're not clinging to faith in the dark. We're following the evidence, and the evidence points toward intelligence behind life. Could this evidence change? Possibly. But until a more plausible naturalistic explanation arises, design is the best current inference. We must follow the most reliable evidence currently available to us, not rely on some hypothetical future knowledge. This doesn't prove a specific religion is true, but it does raise a serious and unavoidable question. If naturalism can't explain life, what can? The answer for now is clear, and it points to a creator. Follow the evidence, even if it leads you away from the worldview you were taught to defend.
But yeah, guys, I pointed out before, this is something that hit me a long time ago. So in order for evolution to get started, for you to have an evolutionary process, you need something at the beginning. What do you need at the beginning? At a bare minimum, you need a living cell. That living cell can't just be any living cell. It needs to have very, very specific properties. And like it needs three things bare minimum for this to even get evolution started. So you need a living cell. That's, I guess you could say four. So one, you need a living cell, something that has like a metabolism and things like that. But as far as these particular features that it needs to have, because keep in mind, suppose you just got lucky and life developed and you got a living cell. Okay, that living cell is eventually going to die. Where's your evolution? How are you getting everything else? You got lucky, it developed, and then why doesn't it just die? So the first feature that you need is when this thing forms, it needs to be able to make copies of itself. And that is a pretty amazing feature of something that just forms by chance, right? It just forms by chance and, oh, it happens to have the ability to make copies of itself. That's pretty amazing. I mean, imagine, you know, a computer forms by chance. Okay, that would be shocking enough. But imagine a computer forms by chance and it makes copies of itself. That's like far more amazing. Anyway, it needs to, whatever this thing is, this first living cell that gives rise to everything else. One, it has to, just from the beginning, be able to make copies of itself. Two, they can't be exact copies, because if it made exact copies, you'd never get any variation. You never get any variation for natural selection to act upon. So it can't make exact copies of itself, but it also can't make very sloppy copies of itself. Like it can't just produce something sloppy and messed up, or that wouldn't preserve the valuable features of the cell that it came from, and so on. So you need a living cell, but that living cell needs to already have the ability to make copies. It needs to make copies that aren't exact, so there's some variation, but three, they have to be pretty darn close so that it preserves the beneficial traits. You need all that before evolution even starts. And so that's why Lennox is pointing out, you need to distinguish between just getting life at the beginning and then what happens afterwards. The evolution is what happens afterwards. As far as getting life, separate question. And so anyway, just, hey, evolution explains everything. You got some splaining to do with this first thing before you even explain the rest of it.
Did you catch all that? David Wood is pointing out that for evolution to even begin, the bare minimum you need is a cell. But getting a cell is already astronomically improbable, and that's just the start. This first cell would also need to reproduce itself, because without reproduction, evolution cannot happen. Think about it. Even if you somehow get the first living cell, it probably wouldn't survive long. It would need to start making copies of itself very quickly. Those new cells would have to be almost identical to the original, but not perfectly identical. Otherwise, you'd never get variation, and thus, no evolution. David's analogy is spot on. It's not just like getting a computer by chance. It's like getting a computer that can make a virtually perfect copy of itself, and that's still an understatement. A modern computer isn't even close to the complexity of the simplest conceivable living cell. Now think about what abiogenesis proposes. That a cell formed by chance, and from the very beginning, it already had the ability to reproduce itself with near-perfect accuracy. That's not just remarkable, it's absurd when you really reflect on it. And yet, if you reject intelligent design of some kind, you're forced to believe that this happened, once, by accident, with no guidance whatsoever. Hearing all of this, atheists might want to approach these questions with a bit more humility before mocking the mysteries of religious belief. Every worldview has its mysteries and unexplained elements. The real question is, which worldview has the fewest contradictions and best accounts for reality? Right now, abiogenesis, the idea that life arose from non-life purely through natural processes, stands as a major problem for naturalism. It is astronomically improbable and, by all current evidence, virtually impossible. On this point alone, let alone all the other arguments, hard atheism becomes difficult to defend. At the very least, this should lead to agnosticism, and better yet, to theism. And why not? You have nothing to lose but your pride, nihilism, and hedonism. I say this somewhat facetiously. But in all seriousness, your life will improve, deeply and meaningfully, when you form a relationship with God. Belief in God doesn't just transform individuals, it elevates societies. The research is clear. When religion or spirituality is done well, it has overwhelmingly positive effects on individuals, families, and communities. So I truly wish you the best, not just intellectually, but spiritually and personally. If you found this valuable, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Consider becoming a channel member to support more content like this. Thanks for watching.